I can't share the screen.
I'm sharing the screen at this point. I wonder if that's why your screen is not sharing. Okay, I'll go ahead and start, and then we'll test your sharing, Max. Okay, welcome everyone. We are excited that so many of you joined us today for this lightning talk session on digital collections in teaching and research. My name is Nashieli Marcano, and I'm research librarian for the humanities and social sciences at Kennesaw State University. I'm also a co-convener of the digital collections discussion group within ACRL's digital scholarship section, which organized this session. I would like to thank my co-convener, Ashley Sergiades, as well as the speakers who will be presenting today. As a reiteration, today's session will be recorded and it will become available to all attendees after the session. We will send you an email with all the links. Now I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. In the spirit of building a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive environment in the DSS community and the community beyond, I would like for us to take a moment to review the guidelines that are appearing in this slide. I will now read a brief statement. The DSS community agrees to frame interactions with DSS spaces and meetings with the following guidelines in mind. We recognize that we all make mistakes and we may unintentionally harm individuals or groups as we engage as a community, but we agree to take responsibility for the results of our words and actions. And as a community, we expect that all DSS meetings will begin with a brief review of this agreement so they become a standard practice for activities and knowledge sharing in this session. Okay, our presenters today will share insights from their work with library digital collections from 3 academic institutions. These projects are each of a unique nature with different aims, and they represent a range of approaches to encourage the use of digital collections for teaching and research. And we will devote the last portion of the session to take questions from audience members. But if you have a question during the presentation, feel free to share them on the chat box, and we'll find a moment to address them. I will now introduce the speakers. First, we have Max Prud'homme. He is Director of Digital Curation at Oklahoma State University. We will then have Ashley Todd-Diaz and Felicity Knox, both from Towson University. Ashley is Assistant University Librarian for Special Collections and University Archives, and Felicity is Archives Associate. Then we'll have Bethany Herman. She's Public Services Librarian at Houston Community College. And now, Max, take it away. I'm going to stop sharing my slide and see if we can share yours.
Hello, everyone. Hope you could hear me. As Nashiela mentioned, yes, I'm Patrice-Andre Prud'homme, Director of Digital Curation at Oklahoma State University. So I would like to begin with the role that archives play in assisting curricula in the academic departments that we work with, including some of the materials and formats that are used before speaking more specifically about digital methods in history class. And before I go into challenges and opportunities and look at how we could further engage with campus. So OSU Archives, I've been assisting students and faculty for quite some time, and coordinating the teaching of a group of students with faculty is very much something that the archives do. It is not uncommon to see students in a Paul Miller room, as you can see, where small students gather. And indeed, the archives are open to students and faculty, and they still are, but as of recently, well, March 2020, they have been open to the public virtually. cursor there. I'm sorry about that. I have a problem with my mouse there. So instructions tend to be coordinated with different departments on campus: English, history, art, and art history, as well as geography. And in assisting faculty and students, this could take place in a variety of ways, like teaching students about archives per se, and the role and importance it plays within the instruction and beyond, and educating/teaching students about collections, the analog materials and the growing volumes of digital collections, but also looking at what new opportunities can arise from this. And all this is done in a spirit of being, to support curricula. For example, archives have taught history and art students about ancient coins from the Roman and Greek period. And in order to best appreciate these artifacts, people would gather around the table in the Paul Miller room, where everyone was able to get the essence of those 3D art objects, even though the collection is accessible online. For other projects, such as field methods classes, there is the opportunity to offer several new avenues of discovery to support faculty and students' curricula more closely associate the analog with the digital. For example, archives and maps and spatial data collaborate in using geographic information systems, GIS, and digital maps to learn about the history of OSU campus and its development over the decades. As part of the archives exhibit and projects, the archive story maps is a rich compilation of several big projects developed with the help of student interns. Story maps are part of the story mapping workshop that the maps and spatial data curator gives. Here are some projects. For example, Angie Debo, Oklahoma's greatest historian, as you can see at the bottom left, and just above that, the website that was dedicated to her 130-year anniversary. There are also other key projects that tell us about architecture, traditions, and events and students on campus, like the history pin that includes selected materials about the history of the university. Williams Hall, which used to be the library. With that in mind, how could we encourage the use of digital collections curated for teaching and research? Well, in terms of offering more to students and encouraging them to use digital collections, archives have introduced undergraduates in a class called Digital Methods in History, more specifically something on oral history, theory, and methodology. The class aims to provide students with an experience on oral history, interviews, and other aspects such as transcribing, editing, archiving, and publishing those oral histories. Just as the course seeks to examine how oral history projects are constructed, administered, and archivally managed, per the request of a history faculty, a colleague and I were invited to speak about the advantages and disadvantages of digitization. I spoke about digitization. My colleague spoke about metadata. Although the topic seems a bit broad, we knew that students were going to be assigned a role on the production side of creating metadata. This is something we touched on since metadata work can be more involved than it may appear to be, as it will depend on the type of project one plans to make accessible, its purpose, and its level of details, depending on the level at which one describes a collection, but also depending on the amount of information known about the collection. So we wanted to give our audience the opportunity to develop a common language around those activities for them to better understand our work. And so we broke our 30 to 40 minute presentation in two parts, digitization and metadata. We gave students a basic understanding of what digitization entails, walking them through a workflow in layman's term, from copyright to discovery and preservation. We also covered protocols such as like taking into account file naming, README files with the importance of documenting, standards that apply in digitizing, as well as the equipment, taking into account the type of format they may have to scan and whether they choose archival standards or not. Personnel and cost, we give them a brief idea about this. Storage, which is important. Discovery and preservation. This applied to metadata as well, where documenting assets is a critical piece of the workflow when it comes to following guidelines and standards, as well as how these data are managed for online access. This was a lot of content, we agree. We nonetheless received good feedback, and we intend to continue our conversation. Speaking about collaborating with other departments, the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program will be teaching the graduate class, they call it 5,000 level here at OSU, or also on oral history and theory and methodology, exploring the technologies involved in the collection of interviews, the reliability of memory, and the utilization of oral histories in various forms of dissemination. We realized it was a lot of content in such short period of time, so we adapted our message accordingly in order to make it palatable to our audience, and at the same time begin developing that same language, the common language, I meant. Especially when presenting that type of material with minimal context, if any, for students to connect the dots. In a sense, it is similar to experiencing the ancient coins in person versus not. I think challenges are also about being intentional about archives and special collections objectives, as well as the mission of the library. They're about aligning user needs with project types, taking into consideration rights permissions and projects that were prioritized for either preservation and or access. And this may apply for on-demand digitization with respect to resources available and other special circumstances. In terms of opportunities and where we could go from that, it's a work in progress, as it could be hard to tell from a first interaction. We received positive feedback, I may reiterate, and we intend to follow through with the information that we delivered and continue developing that common language in order to make students and faculty more aware of what happens behind the scenes in order to bring a collection to fruition. This is one example of a class where the faculty expressed a lot of interest for the student to learn about digitization and metadata. And working with students virtually may have opened new lines of inquiry. And this may not be something, it may not be a new phenomenon. However, I continue receiving inquiries to inform students about digital archives from the art department or art history. With that, I think it's important to develop that idea of sharing a common language with the students and the faculty for them to better understand the behind the scene work that leads into making archival collections available online. I think this way of opening archives to the classroom by going behind the scene digitally and virtually at the same time with them presents an opportunity for students to learn how they could make it happen for themselves. And as we have more and more collections available online. This has been my experience from being on the digital side of archives. And more recently, students seem to want to learn more about digital archives and how to go about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max, for such a wonderful exposition of your projects that you're carrying out with your faculty and students. So far, I don't see any initial questions. We might be holding them off till the end. So then we can go right ahead with our next presenter. Two presenters. We have Felicity. Thank you, Max. Felicity and Ashley. Feel free to share your slides at this point.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashley Todd-Diaz, and I'm joined by my colleague. I don't know if you... I've thrown her.
Oh, so sorry. You know, when you start sharing, your controls go a little different. So sorry about that. Here I am. I'm Felicity Knox, and I'm an archives associate at Towson.
So Felicity and I conduct most of the instruction as a team, and we've been building our instruction, I guess, offering since I joined Towson's team about 5 years ago at this point. And so from year to year, we generally work with history students, a lot of freshman seminar students, art history students, religious studies, family studies, and mass comm. And so we wanted to share kind of our case study or what we've learned in the last year, because up until this point, our digital collections were not necessarily a resource that we drew on heavily for instruction, and I'll talk more about that, but they were kind of a supporting resource for our students, maybe after our instruction sessions, or something that we would point them to for reference. And so the last year with the pandemic, we found ourselves suddenly focusing primarily on our digital collections, as many institutions did, as a way to bring our students and community members into the archives. So our context for our presentation is, of course, the pandemic, and utilizing our digital collections much more robustly, while also migrating our digital collection software from Content DM to Cortex, just for like extra excitement. So next slide, please. All right, so as I mentioned, our instruction program has been building over the last 5 years. When I stepped into my role as Assistant University Librarian for Special Collections and University Archives, we were doing very little instruction. We're a pretty small department. And I would say the most we were working with in terms of departmental students and faculty was the history department. So over the last 5 years, we've really bumped up our instruction offerings, our ability to customize classes and projects and not just kind of do the same show and tell type presentation. But that being said, our materials, right, we generally draw heavily on our physical materials. As you can see from these pictures, our classes are very hands-on. They're very focused on active learning, group projects, and kind of evaluating sources and critically thinking about sources. And for the most part, we work with classes more than once. So we're going to talk about 2 classes that we worked with this past year. One is a freshman seminar that meets typically in the archives for about 1/3 of their class sessions. And so we really get to see the students evolve over their first semester at the university, both with their secondary source research, but also their primary source research. And the second class we're going to talk about is a History 300 class, which at Towson is kind of a research methods class for history students once they have declared a major. So generally it's sophomores and juniors. So between these 3 images, you see how interactive and hands-on and really focused on physical materials our classes are, as well as moving the furniture, using whiteboards, and really emphasizing students' kind of ability to request whatever they would like to see in the archives. So by the end of the semester, they're typically very comfortable requesting materials, looking at finding aids, asking what we might have and where the gaps are in our collections. All right, so next slide. So these are some correspondence that I had with the 2 professors of these classes. So on top we have the freshman research seminar. And generally this class focuses on kind of mid-century university life, right? So it's looking at kind of broader themes within the nation, but through a lens of our local campus community. So students typically research things like student activism, women's rights, the Vietnam War, civil rights movements. You know, there's a variety of kind of repeat topics, but there's always kind of a slight flair to what they're doing. So again, I mentioned they meet with us generally for a third of their class sessions. So about 13 to 15 sessions are held in the archives, either as instruction sessions or research labs. So as we were pivoting because of the pandemic, not only were we trying to figure out how we were going to have the same level of engagement with our students in terms of their class activities and their research, but also what materials we were going to be able to offer them. Because as I mentioned, our digital collections were kind of a supporting role in terms of resources. They're something that we've been developing over the last decade or so, but there has not been a huge push to digitize or be pulling in a lot of digital material. So in this case, we had to figure out what materials were already digitized that we could offer to support various research topics. And this professor was willing to let us come up with a list of topics that we knew the digital collections could support. With the second class, the faculty member was much more interested in identifying topics that directly related to what they were studying in their course. So he created a listing of topics and asked us what materials we had that could fit. And so in this case, we were doing a lot more kind of detective work and reference work in terms of what existed, what did we know off the top of our heads, what could we run into the office to digitize quickly. I mean, and some of the topics were things like suicide and death, women's fashion, and graduation anxiety, which aren't necessarily things that kind of jump out to you off the top of your head. So both of these were unique situations that led to really evaluating our digital collections closely.
So the next part of the process was trying to figure out how to get all of the material that we typically use in those classes into a format that students could actually access virtually. So again, as Ashley said, when working with these classes, we usually leave all the material that they've been working on in carts in the stacks, just so we don't have to constantly shelve and reshelve them. So we typically wind up with 3 or 4 of these carts that you see on top, which we actually end up double stacking with boxes on the top. So we also offer the students volumes of our yearbooks and our student newspapers and all of those things that Ashley said were already digitized, thankfully. So that wasn't as tricky. So once Ashley worked through the topics with the faculty members, it was my turn to try and find the records to go on that sort of detective hunt to try and find what we could to digitize. So for example, we have a flyer, which is part of our 1970s Students for a Democratic Society records. And because we couldn't add content to our digital collections platform, as Ashley said, because we were migrating, we decided that the best way to offer this material was to create essentially our own in-house database. We used OneDrive to create subject folders. So as you see here, these folders do not correspond to the collections we pulled material from, but are instead essentially artificial collections curated specifically for these classes. So this flyer becomes one of many documents that are offered in the campus protests and rallies folder. And as you can see, there are quite a few folders. And ultimately, I ended up scanning over like 500 documents or 500 images over the course of a week during the summer. It was a lot. We also had to think about teaching students how to use primary resources, even in this virtual environment. So typically we break a class into small groups to look at the material before they start doing their own research. Transitioning that to an online class was more of a challenge. We decided to split them into breakout rooms with one staff, archive staff member or faculty member, because we didn't want them to lose focus or have questions without anyone there to assist them. particularly for those students who had never worked with these kinds of materials before, like most of those first-year students. And to better focus their work, we developed a Padlet exercise designed to have them really explore the material in ways that mimicked how they look through those materials or those collections on their own. One class was asked to share material they found that corresponded to specific topics we designated: athletics, administration, campus events, etc. And the other class was asked to work together in groups to do a deep dive into some documents that show various perspectives of the school community around the establishment of the Black Student Union. Of course, we are also challenged by the lack of physical interaction with the students themselves. This was made even more difficult by the fact that most students leave their cameras off during these instruction sessions. So, our job is to be encouraging and helpful, and finding how to do this on camera instead or through the chat screen is a balance that we all really had to adapt to. So ultimately, we learned a few things. The first was that trying to find a way to share this large amount of material in a way that would not be too problematic for students didn't mean that there wouldn't be problems. OneDrive was free for our department to use, but its permissions are, as it says, evil. Just when we thought everything was good to go, someone would message us the student couldn't access the collections. I'd have to reshare the folder, and I feel really sorry for any students who were trying to access it late at night while I was asleep, as students often are doing their work then. Padlet can be a great tool. We could create ways to have students engage with the material. However, the students who were looking at material as a whole sort of got stuck in one collection or another. So we would have lots of photographs and a couple newspaper articles, but not a lot of variety otherwise. The group doing the deep dive into the beginnings of the Black Student Union were also asked to arrange their article write-ups on a timeline. But in the session we used that feature didn't work as we wanted it to, which was disappointing because it didn't give students the agency to do that work themselves.
We also learned that we needed to be prepared for silence. Silence and no cameras, so no engagement. And particularly with breakout sessions where, we thought if we had a few students in a group looking at a digital collection or a digital object, that it might kind of balance out the fact that, people might not feel comfortable. Understanding that a lot of the students we were working with were freshmen, this was their first college experience. They didn't really know their peers, they didn't know their professor, they certainly didn't know us very well because we had only been popping into the class a few times at that point. So it took a lot of patience and just repeating instructions, repeating how to access the digital collections, discussing metadata and what they were looking at, reminding them some ideas for how to evaluate their sources, things that may not be explicit in the metadata that would help them understand context. But ultimately, we realized that the silence didn't mean that the students weren't engaged. We did, as Felicity mentioned with Padlet, we were able to see that the students were diving into the collections and posting things to the Padlet. We saw in their final presentations that they had really engaged with many different collections and items within the digital collections. And most excitingly, our library has an information literacy award each year, and all of the faculty that teach the freshman seminar classes are encouraged to submit a paper to be considered. And one of the students that we worked with in that freshman seminar won the award this year. So Felicity is trying to get me to hurry along. But so our student there, is pictured for her paper that she worked on, focusing, I believe, on women's rights. So that was very exciting. That was a win, I think, for the student and for the strange virtual learning environment that we were in. But that is our lessons learned. So if you have questions, we're more than happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Felicity, for a wonderful presentation. We do have a question from one of our audience members, and that is, can I ask what scanners you folks are using to digitize documents and materials? I'm curious if you folks made preservation grade scans for these classes or access grade scans.
We used, like Max, the Epson 12,000 XL. And I basically, to try and save space for the students to be able to access the OneDrive, I just made things into PDFs. And I think, we didn't have, so the other thing that we were running into was some storage issues on our end for our shared drives. So again, to just save space, I made everything into PDF. After, I think I'm trying to remember if I made larger file images, but I think we were just accessing it.
Okay, great. I don't see any questions, additional questions so far. Thank you again. And now we'll go to Bethany. If you could share your slides at this point.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Just to kind of give you a little bit of an introduction to who I am. Let's see. My name is Bethany Herman, and I represent a little bit of a different and kind of a unique story. I'm a community college librarian at Houston Community College, and I am the liaison for the fashion design and merchandising program at HCC. And so this is going to be a little bit of a story of how a partnership between a department that is usually overlooked by, I think, traditional academic librarians, a more consumer science and arts focused department, and how our relationship really kind of gave birth to one of our most beloved digital collections that we have. So first, I want to actually recognize that most community colleges don't have active archives, and we don't have active institutional repositories like some of our university counterparts. So that's just something to think about during this presentation. So to talk a little bit about the beginning, and one of the slogans for the fashion department is "Know your history, fashion your future." And that is really at the heart of this archive. So to give you a little bit of background, the actual department of the fashion department was established in the 1970s, and about 10 years later, the founding chair, Kay King, decided that she needed to establish some type of physical archive of historical garments, of different types of textiles, of different types of international costuming, and what have you, to really give the students something tactile to focus on, to help inspire them to really understand the intellectual side of fashion design and clothing and garments. And so quickly, this grew into what we have now, which is over 6,000 items that are housed in our fashion department. It's really owned by the fashion department, and it dates all the way back to the 1740s, actually, is our earliest item that we have. So to put this in context, we have items from the 18th century, the 19th century, 20th and 21st century that span the globe. From, we have both high-end designers to very kind of more I think it was Pan Am uniforms of a flight attendant, for instance. So it's really a big, broad range of items that is really of a museum caliber of a collection. And this was primarily used for a teaching tool for fashion students only. Not many people at Houston Community College even knew that this collection existed. So with that in mind, we were giving a lot of physical access to very delicate items that didn't have proper climate controls in this storage space, and it really didn't have any best practices for helping to preserve this collection. And this is where we step in. So this is where it was actually housed, and it is housed still in this same space now, but we have some updates. As you can see, we have some updated archival boxes that were part of our approach to dealing with this. We also have some better practices for handling the items as well. And this is really the collaboration, the archival team. We have our fashion faculty, we have fashion students, and in the middle is Kay King herself. And right next to her to the left is my library director, Erica Hubbard. And this was really kind of her child that it's really a big labor of love between the two of us, or between the two departments. And so what we essentially did is we applied for a grant through the Texas State Libraries and Archive Commission, or TSLAC, for their Texas Treasures Grant. And we began work on actually digitizing the collection back in 2017. And we, as part of the grant, we were able to actually hire a fashion photographer, somebody who has experience in fashion photography, and a curator to help us with dating these items and with putting them into a historical context. So we ended up doing this digitization as it stands currently in 2 different phases. The first phase, we really focused on historical items because that was what our students were using. They were wanting to see historical items in context. And we were trying to identify items that were deteriorating because of the lack of controls, but also that, or even just from being overhandled by people physically. But also items that were very significant for that time period. And that's where our curator, Laura Winslow, was very helpful. And she was a temporary curator that we were only able to hire for this part of the project. But she helped to identify date items for us and to pull items that were very significant for each decade that we were looking at presenting. As part of this, we were also able to, the institution finally realized that, hey, we need to take care of the space, and they updated our climate control. So now we have better control of that will help to hopefully preserve what we have. We put in preservation practices. So we found lots of metal pins inside of these garments that we had to pull out. We had to put them in proper archival garment boxes. Some things have to be laid flat, some can be hung. And even just having people wearing gloves, booties when managing and handling the items as well was kind of part of the new practices that we established. And finally, our initial digital archive was launched in 2018, and later we updated it with a total of over 500 items that included an international costume collection that's more traditional dress and garments, as well as alumni and student work. And that we're hoping that this is just the beginning. So as a resource, we have currently 3 collections within the Fashion Archive. We have our historical collection, and that includes items from back, like I said, that one shoe that they were going to throw out because it didn't have a match, it didn't have a mate. But then as soon as we pulled it out, we're like, no, this is really old, and we got it dated. We're like, no, we're going to preserve this one shoe. So if you have a mismatched shoe, you might want to hold on to it too, right? But we also have designers like Bob Mackie, Oscar de la Renta, Dior, and Zandra Rhodes, and much, much more. Our international collection is more traditional garments that were donated by Kay King, the founding chair of the fashion department, on her travels around the world. And this includes more like traditional special occasion costuming or garments, I should say, like for festivals, for weddings, and she collected it from all over the world, from Afghanistan, Portugal, Guatemala, Thailand, and much more. Our alumni collection, it includes student and faculty work. Fun fact is that a lot of our faculty members at one time were students at HCC. And including local Houston designer Chloe Dow, who donated her 13th look from the season finale of Project Runway season 2, which she actually won. So this was her dress that was part of that final challenge in that reality series. And this is where it really comes into play as far as a teaching tool and a teaching method and how we integrate it in teaching. So oftentimes our 2-year program, in the final year, students have the opportunity to taking a collections course that lasts between 2 different semesters, between the fall and the spring semester. And they have to build a collection over time. On the left-hand side, you see the actual archival item of a burgundy taffeta bodice from the 1890s. And over on our right, Kendall Bullmeyer, who is one of our former students, also worked in the archive and helped with the digitization process. She actually used that as inspiration for her collection, and you can see her garment on the right-hand side there. So that's one example of how we've used it in the classroom. So that is our current web address, is the Fashion Archive. And the collection also exists in Art Store. And so far, what this has done is that we've had a global response, and it's reached the globe. We've had documentary filmmaker from the UK actually contact us because they found an item that was made by one of their ancestors. Which is really, really unique. And we also had a relative of Reza Khan, who was a Houston-based Iranian designer, and they were able to give us an oral history, kind of providing some context for the items that were in our collection as well. And we also hope to expand this by forthcoming, so we're hoping to make it more and more open and available to the public. Google Arts and Culture it should be added hopefully soon within the next year. And our plan is to add collections like oral histories of the items that are donated, because we have a lot of socialites that are in the Houston area that have graciously donated some of their items. That also will hopefully, even just having an oral history of the archive itself and the history of the institutional history, we're hoping to preserve more of that. We have some textiles that are from around the world that we're hoping to kind of present, and especially with Japanese textile making and styles. And we have some really great examples of that we're hoping to digitize, as well as some photographs of old like department store displays that we somehow have them, but we were like, this would be amazing and excellent for people to be able to access. And so where this has really kind of become useful as a digital resource using in the classroom. So in my instruction pre-COVID, and also during COVID too, if I can get them live in a online classroom, we have a lot of Fashion 1300 students. Our Fashion 1300 class is really to establish an introduction to fashion as an industry. So if students are wanting to see, is this something I want to major in, they take this class. And what I'll actually do is I'll assign them a decade, and they have to pick an item from that decade and search for it in our fashion archive. And then they have to go over to our more academic sources, Bloomsbury Fashion Central, for instance, and search for an item that relates to that, or search for an article or for a resource that ties it to the item that they picked from their assigned decade. And then we also bring in the kind of like, well, here's a primary source here. Now we're going to our more academic secondary sources. And then I pull in Women's Wear Daily, which is a trade journal essentially for the fashion industry. It's considered like the primary industry publication for fashion. And then I have them search and think about how to search and find yet another article in a trade journal for that connects both to their academic article and to their primary source. And this really kind of helps to demonstrate like how different sources of information are used in different ways, but also how you can use it to connect it to create a larger story. And also during the time of COVID, so how this became really kind of an integral part of some of our coursework. A year ago, when we all of a sudden went all virtual, fashion was primarily all in person. And our ready-to-wear students who did ready-to-wear construction for a class, they would have to go out to find a garment in a department store or a boutique, write about the designer, look at the garment, price it out, and get some comparisons to physical items. Well, stores were closing down. They were not able to necessarily do that. So instead, they shifted to assigning them a designer that was in the fashion archive, and they had to pick an item of that designer and do their garment report using some of the items in our archive. So as a digital resource, this also, we're hoping to broaden this out more to, we've presented this to our humanities departments as saying, hey, look at this primary source that we have. Also to English and sociology of saying, hey, this gives opportunities for developing an idea of people's lives and what they wore, and also tying it to socioeconomic status, but also events that were going on in that time period. And you can see how things have shifted throughout time in this like kind of odd timeline that we have in fashion. It's also been used for our film and theater as source material for creating costuming and designs. And in the community, this has really helped to kind of build visibility of the collection, that we now have members of the Houston community wanting to donate some of their items, from their couture high-end things to even things that might be beneficial to our students. And yeah, and this is just kind of an ongoing collaboration between us librarians and the library and our fashion department. And we're hoping that in the future, we can actually get somebody really dedicated to this, because this is like a sliver of my job, not my entire job. But also I wanted to, before I end things, I wanted to just to give credit to our wonderful photographer, Shane Qureshi. Photos are courtesy of him and the Houston Community College. And you can also follow him. There's his handle on Instagram. He's a really wonderful photographer, and I highly recommend checking out his work. And please do reach out to us. We are on Instagram. You can follow us and see some of like how wonderfully detailed these pictures are. We don't just do the front and back. We show the construction of the garments. We show labels, which has oddly been very helpful for a lot of these vintage and historical fashion hobby groups on Facebook, oddly. And also there's our archive address, and you can also contact me at my email, bethany.herman@hucs.edu. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Bethany. This has been another super interesting presentation. And just to give the presenters some feedback from the audience, this is totally fascinating. Also, the fashion department should open a museum gallery. This stuff is so wonderful. Okay, so let me just share a quick slide here so we continue.
I see a question that can I address a question that I see?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm going to read it
Sure.
out. Any suggestions on how to better teach simultaneously online with a room full of archival material? I taught a synchronous online class showing the students who were in Zoom archival material on camera. Synchronous because I was given a broad scope, but wanted to tailor my talk to the students' interests, following up where their curiosity was piqued. Go ahead. I think Bethany, you could address that, and I welcome the other presenters to respond.
So really, our digitization process is actually part of trying to step away from that, because we were letting students in that room that I was showing. It's very small. So part of the digitalization process was to try to avoid having a lot of students in the same space as these materials, because a lot of them were kind of like, they were fragile enough that when we were trying to move some pieces, they were falling apart. So, and that becomes we want to try to preserve this as much as possible. So doing synchronous things, and I didn't show you the actual digital archive, but if you go and you look at the pictures, they're very high resolution. They show the detailings of like even the construction of some of the items, the tags, the small textural details. And that's really what we're trying to hone in for our students, at least, as far as kind of understanding, oh, I'm taking a textiles class and I need to understand what different types of weave look like for different types of materials. And that's really became very beneficial, almost better, because we're both preserving the item and the students, especially now when we're mostly remote, can access it at the same time.
Okay. Any other presenter who would like to touch on this aspect?
So because our university has been pretty much virtual only. There's very few people on campus. We haven't had any situations where we've been teaching from kind of the archives and sharing physical materials virtually. We talked about how we would do that with reference if there was a situation where somebody really needed to see something and we could only really say use an iPad to zoom in on, say, a particular document or a particular part of a book. And I've actually thought about how I will do this because there's a professor who wants to bring his upper level history class in, if possible, in April. And I'm sure that some students won't be able to come in just because of social distancing and whether or not they feel comfortable. And so figuring out how I can best use the cameras that are in the room and perhaps an iPad, and again, adding things to our digital collections if need be, to best provide a shared experience for the people who are in person as well as online. But so far it is uncharted territory for me.
Okay, I will move on to the next question. Thank you. Can fashion materials be sufficiently digitized? There's so many other features, the touch, the lighting from different angles, the weight, et cetera, that can't be captured through typical digitization.
So yes, I will argue that we've done a fairly decent job of doing just that, because instead of hiring an archivist and a museum curator to do this, we also hired a fashion photographer who's really familiar with how clothes move, how to best light them, how to best present them. And we did many tests on even just the gray background that you see on all of that, what's going to be the best background for the different types of items. And it was really done with a lot of thought and care, just because of that very reason. If you were to see something like this at the Met, for instance, and you look at their collection, sometimes their collections don't have as detailed as pictures as we do. And I would highly recommend taking a look at the collection, and you can kind of like play around, click on the different pictures, zoom in, zoom out. We're hoping, because we're currently on Omeka, and that's really more favored for text-based documents as opposed to like image documentation. And we're hoping to eventually move, and I don't remember exactly what, but it's going to be part of our larger institutional record keeping. So we're, fingers crossed, we're hoping that we can migrate to something a little bit more agile and friendly search-wise than just Omeka. But definitely look it out. There's one dress in particular that I'm thinking of, and I probably should have showed it, where they actually did rig the shot to show kind of the ruffles and the movement of it. And it really captures the spirit of the design, I think, really, really, really well.
Great, and now we have a comment, fascinating. It says, with regards to the question above about how to teach responsibly, our store has great presentation tools built in, and HCC has collection materials in our store. Thank you for sharing that, Christopher. Now we have another question. This one is for Ashley and Felicity. Our assistant curator of instruction had set up an iPad on a camera stand sitting on a book cart, which I could roll in front of the materials that I had set up in the conference room of the Special Collections reading room. There was a problem with glare from the framed images. The iPad screen was narrow, but I would toggle between the iPad camera and the one on my laptop camera. I was logged into 2 Zoom instances simultaneously, where one instance had the sound manually turned off to prevent feedback. I did it alone so I could be unmasked. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we have another comment. Oh yeah, this is a response to, okay, Ashley, you have just responded to this person. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, both in terms of what worked and where the challenges are. We have cameras set up in our primary archives classroom, so I plan to use that for a wide shot and perhaps an iPad for a close-up. But I'm sure there will be a learning curve, absolutely. And then Christopher has another comment. If HCC wants materials out in the world, make them available in IIF, International Image Interoperability Framework and Standard. Thank you so much, Christopher. Any other questions? I'd like to pose a question to all panelists. When it comes to the research findings and the new knowledge that has been created and your interactions with students and faculty, has there been any particular finding that has been surprising to you? Something that you didn't expect to find? An interesting fact?
I think for me, I was interested to see how the students interacted with digital collections, where they got caught up in just getting to the website and creating a search. So, I mean, we would think generally that evaluating sources might be a challenge, or finding a particular source that might suit a researcher. Pardon me, it's very windy and the doors are slamming in my house. But really, we found that students, depending on how familiar they were in general with our library's website, throwing a new resource at them, even if it was on the same website and had a similar search bar and had similar facets as many other databases, it was a very different experience for them, and just navigating and finding things. I mean, there were a lot of aha moments that suddenly when they got into it, they wanted to share what they were finding. But it took a little while for them to get comfortable.
What I, excuse me, what I perceived is that students, maybe they're discovering, they want to continue the conversation, but maybe in terms of a career move, it's maybe something that they were not aware of and they want to learn more. And it's just, that's what I was stating, so how they could go about it, as they're getting more awareness of the behind the scene. They had no clue before. In fact, mid-April, I'm speaking to another class about that kind of line of inquiry, really. So I look forward to it. We'll see what happens.
So one thing that I've noticed with the way that we are currently showing our digital collection is that a lot of our students are, especially within the fashion department specifically, they want that kind of Google feel of searching. So, and because there's been some challenges, like I find that like we've had to kind of teach around the resource that we have available. And this really is something that is a very grassroots collection that was kind of done we've had the blessing of the institution, but I think a lot of people didn't really understand, especially in our administration, just what we had and the value of it. And we're still trying to kind of put pressure from the ground up to getting more resources and help with that. So my hope is that as we start integrating it more in the curriculum, as we're getting more awareness of this, and also thank you, Christopher, for your suggestion. I wrote that down. As it becomes more visible, that this will actually kind of put some pressure on administration to back it up with some proper funding so we can have it in better platforms that are a little bit more visually appealing for students who are so used to searching and having that kind of visual tactile search function.
I think we are about to conclude. Thank you so much. Let me share one more thing before we conclude. I just want to make an announcement of our upcoming lightning talk. Let me see if I can get a hold of the slide. If not, that's okay. Yeah, I think I closed the one. Hold on one quick second. It's going to be on April 23rd. Let me open up the actual slide so I can share it. Apologies for the delay here. Here it is. All right, so let me do the slideshow right now. It's going to be on enhancing digital collections, teaching and research with digital tools on April 23rd. The link is included in the slide, and we hope that we get to see you on part 2. On behalf of our section, I would like to thank our presenters and also the audience members for being able to engage in this conversation. These were all exciting projects, very insightful, and I'm sure your students and faculty appreciate the amount of work that entails not to have these collaborations take place. Thank you. We're receiving thank you for the audience from the audience members. And yes, I will see you next time. I will save the chat and I will make the recordings available to you all via email, okay? You all take care. Bye-bye.